delighted to have on Outsiders the chairman of the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security. He's also a former SAS officer. His stance on China led to the Chinese Communist government locking him and his colleague James Patterson from visiting China on a study tour and demanded that they repent from their views. Very totalitarian, very Orwellian. During his army training, he had to endure a 3-day extreme interrogation session involving constant sleep deprivation and starvation, and he still refuses to go on Q&A. But he always comes here on Outsiders. Great to see you, Andrew Hastie. How are you, mate?
I'm well, thanks, Rowan. Thanks for that wonderful introduction.
Our pleasure. Now, look, you've been 3 times this week, the Global Times. That's the Chinese mouthpiece. Pretends it's an independent newspaper, but of course it isn't. It's the mouthpiece of the Chinese Communist Party. Have been attacking you, calling you a Wolverine, based on that movie Red Dawn in the 80s. Why are they so upset with you? How come you've antagonised the Chinese?
Well, that's a great question. Not just me, but also Senator James Patterson and Senator Kimberley Kitching. So it's a bipartisan ticket they're attacking here. It's a really good question. You know, it reads a bit like the Batuta Advocate without any of the humour. But essentially, they're unhappy about us standing up for Australian sovereignty. And there's a group of us. In fact, it's more than just 3. I could list a whole list of names, but we have more than 20 senators and MPs from the Australian Parliament who put their name to a letter last week backing in the foreign ministers of the UK, Canada and our own Marise Payne in support of the Hong Kong protesters. So it's a big number. It's not just us 3, and they're just trying to push us around, and we're not for turning.
And nor for repenting, it would appear. What do you make... When you first raised the issue of China about a couple of years ago, you were the first, along with James Patterson, raising concerns. You got an awful lot of stick from an awful lot of quarters. People attacked you from every side. All the lovies piled on in. You were demonised as usual. But pretty much everything you warned about then now appears to be accepted as being true. I guess, do you feel vindicated? And B, what on earth do you make of Daniel Andrews and this Victorian Belton Road fiasco?
Well, Rowan, my view is that my job as a parliamentarian is to call it how I see it. I did that. My colleagues do the same. And if we cop incoming, well, that's part of the job. We're good for it. We can stand up under it. And at the end of the day, our bottom line is sovereignty, which is why it's a bipartisan move afoot at the moment to push back on and protect Australian sovereignty. As for Daniel Andrews, look, he's out on a limb. He's off the reservation, in my view. He shouldn't be making foreign policy. He shouldn't be entering into strategic arrangements, particularly when he doesn't even have approval from DFAT. We saw their press release on Friday afternoon killing off reports, in fact, that somehow the Commonwealth gave tacit approval for them to enter into BRI. So he's all out there on his own.
Rita.
Well, he is, and we don't know how far out on his own he is because there's not much transparency around this particular arrangement. But it's not just the Global Times who've come after you, calling you Wolverine. I think that's actually quite a cool little slur if you've got to cop one. But your own paper, the West Australian, your hometown's paper, also did a bit of a hit piece on you. Can you tell us about that?
Well, Rita, I've already said something on my Facebook about that, and I was just standing up for myself and correcting the record. That's the beauty of social media now. As the media market further disaggregates, we all have a voice, and I chose to use mine, my local paper, which is owned by seven...
Do you think that it's that ownership of the paper that has motivated this unfair hit piece to try to malign you because of some random person posting something on Facebook? Do you think Kerry Stokes has been fairly outspoken about wanting relations with China to improve and the importance of trade? Do you see a relationship there?
Rita, I don't want to get into speculation. I'll take each issue one by one. It's a Sunday, it's a new week, and I've said my piece on that one. And I think I'll leave it there. But I'll leave it to you, the commentators, to have a view on that.
James.
Okay.
I just wanted to change gears a little bit then. As a military man and a strategically minded person, this Global Times paper is part of a huge propaganda effort around the world to basically attack absolutely everybody who China doesn't like, which seems to be just about everybody. So they've gone Brazil, they've gone India, they've gone the EU, they go countries around the world. It's not just here in Australia. Strategically, what do you think China's aims are here? Is this just really for domestic consumption to whip up nationalism within their borders? Because looking at it, it seems to me that China is going to wind up with very few friends very quickly, and they're only accelerating the process of the world decoupling from the Chinese economy and Chinese supply chains. Can you give us any of your insights into this, having studied the Chinese issue very closely?
Well, I think the Global Times serves as a propaganda mouthpiece for the Chinese Communist Party. And I think the intent in naming me, the Senators James Paterson and Kimberley Kitching, was to intimidate us a bit, to make us go quiet, which we won't. In fact, all it does is further, harden our position, not in a bad sense, but in our defence of Australian sovereignty. It's part of a push to effectively whip countries onto their side. At the moment, the World Health Assembly vote, which passed the independent inquiry motion unanimously, certainly would be worrying for them. You saw a whole group of countries coming together and saying, yes, we want transparency around the start of the coronavirus. They'll target individuals who are speaking their mind, and I think that's just part of a global approach to information operations, which they use.
Andrew, I'll just read you this little bit from the Global Times article about yourself, Kimberley and James. And this is typical Chinese propaganda. I'd like to get your thoughts on it. And it says, it asserts, there are 3 reasons behind Australia's rising anti-Chinese racism. So they're calling it racism, what standing up for sovereignty is all about. And they say, to begin with, white Australia has remained at the core of Australia's national identity. The country has gradually tilted towards the US to look for more social identification in being white. Second, many Australians believe COVID-19 originated in China. Yes, and they may discriminate against the Chinese because they ignorantly believe it's the Chinese people who spread the virus. Well, nobody believes that. And third, Australia has always discriminated against Asians, especially Chinese. This is the Communist Party of China trying to whip up race hatred.
Well, that's it's an effective way to attack people like me and others, is to suggest that we're racist. Put the lens of identity politics over the top of all of this and delegitimise our views, which are quite legitimately held. It's ultimately about Australian sovereignty, which includes our strategic freedom of action, our ability to govern ourselves in accordance with our values and traditions, and to pursue our interests around the world without interference from other countries. So there's nothing wrong with that, and to suggest that it's somehow motivated by race is an effective way of attacking us. So, well, they've
clearly learnt the identity politics of the left, as you said earlier. To what extent, Andrew, is the left wing in Australia enmeshed with the Chinese Communist Party? Is it a dangerous degree, or is it purely an ideological? What are the links there that you see?
I think the tools of political correctness can be used by anyone, because in the end, political correctness is a way of controlling people. It's a means of power. And so if you can control what people say, you can control what people think. So, it's not surprising that people with authoritarian or totalitarian instincts use political correctness as a way of shutting people up. And whether it's, the CCP through the Global Times or a group of people cyber lynching you on Twitter, it's essentially the same means to power, if you want to use that term.
Rita?
Well, Donald Trump's come out this week and terminated the US's relationship with the World Health Organization. What do you think Australia should do next? Of course, we've called for the independent inquiry, but should we be wanting some genuine reform at the World Health Organization as well?
You bet. We've been arguing for several weeks now that we want reform. I think that's right and proper, given the failure of the World Health Organization over the last few months, particularly with the start of the coronavirus and its inability to prepare other countries for its spread. So, look, I'm disappointed that the US is pulling out. We want the US involved in as many global institutions that we are. because the US, I believe, is a force for good in the world. We're going to stay because we're a regional power with global interests, and we need to stay engaged through every mechanism that we can, particularly in the Asia-Pacific region. It's really important that we stay involved as part of our step-up. So the US has their interests, we have our interests. Of course, we align on values and other democratic traditions. But when it comes to the World Health Organization, I think the Prime Minister's made the right call there.
James.
This week also, Donald Trump moved to pull the visas of Chinese students, graduate students in the United States who had been connected to military universities in the United States. We've seen some cases of worrying connections between academics from China studying in Australia. Is there any move underway to do anything similar here? Are we concerned about academics with links to these military universities, not civilian, but military universities in China coming here, possibly using our research for nefarious purposes or potentially committing academic and other sorts of espionage?
James, there's three principles I keep coming back to, which is sovereignty, transparency, and resilience. Your question engages sovereignty and transparency. Where research in our universities is of national significance, or it goes to our strategic interests, we need to preserve that and protect that. And I know Dan Tehan, as the Education Minister, set some guidelines for universities last year. But transparency is something we need more of in the university sector. A lot of money flows into our universities. There are a lot of relationships involving research collaboration with foreign partners. And I think what the Australian people need to see is where those relationships begin and end, and how they're being leveraged overseas, potentially against our interests. So my call would be, first of all, let's have transparency. Let's see where the money's coming from, where the research is going, and then we can start making some decisions about the future direction of our research.
Andrew, you're the chairman of the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security, so you know your stuff about security and intelligence. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo on Outsiders last week said that if the situation arose where America felt that Victoria's Belt and Road deal was jeopardising telecommunications in any way, they would simply disconnect. What is as a military man, how foolish do you think the Victorian government is being at the moment?
Well, the good thing is that the federal government over the last few years has been doing a number of things to protect our sovereign interests. You'll be aware of the espionage and foreign interference legislation, the ban on Huawei for our future 5G network. And we also introduced in 2018 the Security of Critical Infrastructure Act. So that creates a central register of all our critical infrastructure, which includes power grids, telecommunication networks, water assets, ports and the like. So if Daniel Andrews was to include, as part of the BRI, one of those critical assets, that legislation would be triggered and the federal government would be all over it. So I have confidence that we can manage this. But like I've said during the week, transparency is critical here. Let's see the paperwork that Daniel Andrews has entered into, put it out there. And I think the opposition in the Victorian Parliament, and I think there's also potential in the federal Parliament for committees to look more closely at some of these arrangements so that the Australian people have transparency.
Andrew Hastie, thanks so much for coming on Outsiders, and great to see you. And Outsiders fans always love to hear your points of view, particularly on our sovereignty. Andrew Hastie, thanks so much.